Hello and welcome to AGG, the podcast, and I'm very pleased to be talking today to Phil Bradley. Phil, you've entitled your life story from CD-Rom to AI, and let's. I hope that we can go through that story. But you started out with a degree in library studies.
I did, yeah. I was quite a precocious child, I think, and I was looking at sort of like 10, 11, 12 as to what kind of career I wanted. And I was in the library checking different career things out. And then I thought, I'm in a library. Why don't I become a librarian? And so I had a careers interview at school, and they said, what do you want to become? And I said, I want to be a librarian. And I remember the woman was saying to me, oh, is that because you like books? And I said, no, it's because I want the power. And she gave me a completely blank look. And I said, it's a powerful profession. And she said, well, what do you mean? And I said, you don't need to know anything. You just need to know how to find things. And once you know how to find things, that makes you a very powerful person. And that's what I'm interested in being able to do. And so that was really what started me off on the career. And then, I got my honours degree in librarianship from the Polytechnic of North London. And then I went to work for the British Council in the UK, which was an organisation designed to promote Britain abroad. And that was when I got involved in training for the first time. We had a lot of people from overseas offices that would come to the UK, and I discovered that I quite liked teaching, and that was really what started me on the whole career of teaching people about information work.
So who were you training at the British Council?
It was predominantly locally engaged staff that the British Council had around the world. They would bring them to London, and we would run training courses for them. And I was specifically doing stuff on how to use reference books and getting information generally. But as time progressed, I got involved with we had a number of education fairs abroad in the Far East, and I got involved in teaching representatives from UK universities about how to put promotional videos together. I was also involved in answering questions on bogus universities and colleges that we had in the UK at that period of time. And so I was teaching people about that aspect as well. So generally, I just sort of fed into teaching a whole variety of different things. With the council, they got me to go abroad, and my first trip abroad was to Lesotho in southern Africa, and I had to run a 2-week course on the basics of librarianship, which was fun and enjoyable to do. And it was the first time I'd ever really done anything of that kind of length, in fact. But I really enjoyed it.
Sounds fascinating, but it's quite a jump to go from starting at the British Council and then moving on to sort of 2 weeks, 2 weeks studying all of librarianship. Didn't you find it sort of alarming to? Go on.
I was somewhat taken aback, but the boss that I had at the time said, you can teach people, you can train, you're really good at it. And she'd seen something in me that I hadn't. And so I took her at her word. I went to Lesotho. I trained on the basics of librarianship for 2 weeks. They got a lot out of the course. I came back, and then I sort of had carved a new niche out for myself. And I started to do more training for British Council offices and going around the world to different countries, teaching aspects of librarianship generally, but reference work and things of that nature. And I found that I really enjoyed doing it.
You worked for a while with a Silver Platter, which was the pioneer of CD-ROMs. What was the idea behind that?
I went to a conference, and I saw CD-ROM being demonstrated for the first time. And I thought, this is just the most remarkable thing. And if I've got any skills at all, it's being able to see which technologies are going to become important in the future. And I looked at CD-ROM and I thought, this is going to be really, really important. The British Council wasn't interested in exploring that, and it was certainly something that I wanted to do. So I took a leap of faith, took a 60% salary cut, and moved to Silver Platter to become their technical support director for Europe. Now, bear in mind, I knew a little bit about computers, but I didn't know an awful lot. But Silver Platter said it would be easier to train a librarian how to work with technical stuff than it would be to train a technical person how to work with librarians. And I like to think that they were right with that. So what I did initially was I had to learn how CD-ROMs worked. I had to learn how to install CD-ROM drives into a variety of different computers. I had to do troubleshooting, and I was on the end of the phone for when librarians would ring up and ask how to do whatever it was that they needed to get a computer up and running with a CD-ROM. And I was asking, yeah, I know it doesn't work. Is that because you put the CD disc in the wrong way up, or have you turned the CD-ROM drive on? Yeah, it was really basic at that level. But at that point, nobody knew anything. So it really was breaking an awful lot of ground. And I was really interested in doing it. And then I went from that to teaching librarians more generally how CD-ROM technology worked. I got asked to write my first book about going online and CD-ROM technology and the differences and the similarities between the two of them. And so that was the first time that I ever thought about writing, which again, I found that I really enjoyed doing. And so my role sort of slowly morphed in the 5 or 6 years that I was at Silver Platter, from doing a lot of technical support and wandering around the country and appearing at shows and conferences, predominantly obviously for librarians, always spending my time with librarians, demonstrating to them how our software worked, teaching them how to search using the software that we had at the time. And then Silver Platter was a very enterprising and I think enlightened organization at that point. And they decided that they wanted to have a training department. And so I became the global director of training. And that meant that I spent a lot of my time wandering around the world, running training courses for librarians on how to install CD-ROM drives, how to search the databases that we've got, the concepts behind CD. And yeah, I love doing that. And I spent a good couple of years teaching that. I was also asked at the same kind of period of time. There was a training organisation in the UK, and they said to me, would you like to run training courses for us on CD-ROM? And I checked with Silver Platter, and they said, fine, go ahead and do it, because it was going to be promoting them. And so I started running my own courses for librarians on the basics of CD-ROM, installing drives. I would get a whole bunch of computers, and we would open the computers up, and I would get them to insert interface cards and how to install the software. And in those days, it was much more complicated than it is now. And you had to edit various batch files on the computer before the whole thing could work. So I spent a lot of time teaching that, and I really enjoyed doing that. And that was about 93 or 94. And in the background, I'd seen this thing called the internet, and I got a connection to the internet in the end of 91 or the beginning of 92. And I spent quite a lot of time playing around with that. and I could see similarities and parallels with CD-ROM technology. So for quite some time, I was seeing two parallel technological paths developing within the information industry, which I found really interesting.
CD-ROM was turned out to be quite a fleeting technology, that didn't last as long as people anticipated. Why do you think it had such an influence?
CD-ROM was incredibly important, and I don't think people realised how important it was. Before CD-ROM, to search a database, it was very expensive. It was very complicated. You had to have a specialized computer that could actually do all of that for you, and they were quite rare and unusual. So online searching was a very complicated process. It was a very arcane process, and not many people were able to do it, and information was still kept closely to a small number of professionals. When CD-ROM came along, it changed the role of the information professional from a gatekeeper, which they'd been in the past, to a facilitator. And it meant for the first time that your end users in your organization were able to get access to information themselves. And they'd never really been able to do that before. And rather than have to ask the librarian for the information that they needed, or come down to the library and search through a reference book, they were able to search a database that wasn't in their room. And we were involved in the first networking of CD-ROM databases in the entire country. And we were one of the pioneers in the entire world. And so I spent a lot of time teaching librarians how to network CD-ROM drives. So the first thing that CD-ROM really did, I think, was it opened out the world of information from your information professionals to the end users. But what it also did, quite crucially, was it introduced to librarians the idea and the option to be able to start playing around with computers, to be able to open computers up, to install interface cards, to work with their technical support departments. And it meant that they were able to extend the reach of their library beyond that room in the university or the school or the bank or whatever else it might happen to be. And they were able to get outreach for the first time. They were able to teach a lot of their users, or their patrons if you prefer the American version, how to do internet searching. So it gave them an ability to learn new skills and to move beyond the confines of the book and beyond the confines of the physical library that they happen to find themselves in. That then, over the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, really, was an opportunity for growth for the information profession. One of the things that I did find very irritating was that when we got to the point of being able to network CD-ROM drives, the technical support departments in the universities, the schools, the banks, wherever, they suddenly got interested in it, and they said, oh, this is for us, this is our role, this is our job. You're just a librarian. You're not going to be able to do that. We're taking that away from you and doing it ourselves. And I found that incredibly frustrating, because it had shown librarians that they were capable of doing much more than simply dealing with books and finding out facts in reference works and so on. They were being able to see for the first time that there was a different future that was available for them. But then it was like kind of stolen away from them at that point. But by that point, the idea that information could get out to a much wider variety of people was becoming fairly commonplace. And people were beginning to expect that, if I need to get some bibliographic data on something, I can just log into it from my computer on my desk. and get the information that I need that way. And it sounds really stupid these days, but in those days, back in the early 1990s, it wasn't something that was common. You didn't get CD-ROM drives in computers, and then we went through the whole period when you would buy a new computer and you would get a CD-ROM drive attached to it, and now we've gone full circle where CD-ROM drives, DVD drives, what have you, are no longer required. But for that period of time, it really was an exciting development, an explosion of technology, an explosion of skills and understanding about how information could be democratized and it could be made available to a much wider group of people. And for me, very importantly, it meant that librarians were able to take on new roles of the facilitator, of the trainer, of the people in the organization that suddenly became really important at the center of the organization, who were able to get the information and spread it out to people in a way that had never really been possible before. And I think it raised the profile of the library and, most importantly, the librarian in the organization. So, yeah, it was short-lived, if you can say 5 or 6 years was short-lived, but it was an incredibly important period of time.
You use the word empowerment, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. Empowering libraries, empowering librarians to do more. But do you think it's true to say that that empowerment hasn't been shared, perhaps isn't shared in the library community today? You tend to get a bit of a divide between technically competent and less technical staff.
Yeah, one of the things that has always frustrated me about librarians through my entire career is that they haven't really appreciated how important, how valuable, and how powerful their job is. And if I've tried to do anything at all during the 30 or 40 years that I've spent in the industry, it is trying to really get librarians to understand that we are the most powerful and the most important profession in the world. Now, you can then come back to me and say, yeah, but doctors are more important than librarians, and maybe engineers are more important than librarians, or computers, whatever. And it's a valid opinion, but I would then come back and say, yeah, doctors are really important. How did they learn to become a doctor? They had to train. They had to learn. Oh, where did they learn? They had to go to a library. They had to ask an information professional. And every powerful profession that we've got in the world is powerful because they've learned what they needed to from librarians, information professionals, libraries. Every single profession that's out there needs librarians, and they need library services. And so I maintain, as I have always done, that librarians are the most important and the most powerful information profession of all, bar none. Doctors, scientists, engineers, you can include all of them. Librarians are more powerful. And the frustration that I've always had during my career is that a lot of librarians really haven't been able to understand that. If I had a pound for every time somebody would say to me, oh, I'm just a librarian, I'd unfortunately be very rich. But it's something that I heard a lot. They would say, I'm just a librarian. And my viewpoint is, you are not just a librarian, you are the librarian. You are a really important person. You're the person in your organization that everybody needs to come to. The library should be the touchstone that every other department has to come to. The library needs to be the central core of how your organization, your university, your bank, your school, whatever it happens to be, that needs to be right at the center of everything that the organization does. The public library needs to be right at the centre of the entire community, and it needs to be able to support that community, to help that community to grow, to provide whatever requirements and needs and information that community needs in order to help it prosper. Libraries are incredibly important, and some librarians, I think the majority of librarians, do get that, and they do understand that in order to continue the work that they're doing, they do need to have a really good understanding of technological skills. They need to be able to understand how to search the internet. They need to know how to utilize social media. They need to know how to work with AI, because they need to be able to pass that information on to other people. Because librarians, ultimately, as far as I'm concerned, they are facilitators. And that's what we have always done. It's just that we're now in a position to do it in a very, very different way. I don't think, and this will probably raise a few eyebrows, I don't think libraries are about books. They've never been about books, ever. Libraries are about providing access to information, to democratizing information, to getting that information out to the people that need it in the best possible, quickest, fastest, most effective way. And for, millennia, that's been with books. And so it's understandable that people do tend to link a library with a collection of books. But you can get a collection of books in a bookshop. It's not a library. You can get a collection of books in a charity shop. That's not a library. The library is not bound and defined and constrained by the physical item. It is defined by the librarian, who uses whatever it is that they need to, whether it's a book, a journal, a magazine, a newspaper, a computer. It's the librarian who gets the information to the people in the most effective way possible. And in order to do that, they do have to have a skill set which is far more than working with books. They need to understand technology. They need to work with technology on a daily basis. They need to be able to manipulate it to do whatever it is that they want it to do. And what I've seen during the period of my career, right from CD all of the way through to AI, is that some librarians are able to understand that and to appreciate that and to take the technological advancement that's been made available and to be able to make it their own and push the library forward when you're defining library as the source of information. And I don't care whether the source of information is in a book or a magazine or in a bibliographic database or it's created with AI, whatever it happens to be. It's the role of the information professional to get the information in the most effective way and to get it out to the end users, the patrons and so on that they've got as effectively and as quickly as possible. And with the introduction of all of these different technologies over the period of time, the most effective librarians are always the ones that can pick the technology up, make it their own, introduce it to the rest of their organization, and teach the people in their organization how to use it, and then move on and do the next thing that they need to. That, for me, is the definition of a good librarian or an information professional. It's not somebody that's good at stamping books. That's not what being a librarian to me is about.
The paradox of the you mentioned the arrival of the internet in the late 90s, and when the internet started and search engines like Google, there was a feeling many people thought that that the library had become irrelevant because everyone could do searches for themselves. So what was the role for the librarian sort of when Google came along?
Yeah, I think I will pick you up on one point there. The internet, certainly for me, started in 1991, 1992, as it did for a lot of other academic librarians. Admittedly, it was at a very fledgling point at that time. We didn't have graphical user interfaces. If you wanted to get something from the internet, you had to use things like Veronica, Archie, Jughead. You would use Usenet groups to discuss things with different people. When I first started using the internet in the very early 90s, the idea of graphics, the only graphics you got were ASCII graphics. You didn't get anything else. It was all just words. I was blown away by the idea that you could have email addresses, and the fact that you could get answers in hours rather than in days or weeks, because you had to send a letter of some sort. That was an incredible change. It sounds silly to say it now, but in those days, the fact that you were able to virtually instantly have a conversation with somebody on the other side of the world was unheard of. It just didn't really happen because you couldn't afford to ring people up and talk to them. You just couldn't do that. And that for me was, again, a very tempting aspect of the internet, in that it was democratizing information. It was democratizing the access and the communications that people could have with people. I ran my first internet course in, I think it was 1994, and it was a day-long course. And we talked about what is this internet thing, because nobody really knew what it was. And I would spend a lot of time trying to get librarians to understand how the internet worked, what it was, what it did, what its advantages were, what its disadvantages were. I had to teach them how to access the information. And by then, we just started to get early browsers like Netscape, for example. I was teaching them how they worked. And I wrote a couple of books in the early days about how information professionals could and should start using the internet. In 1995, I spent a lot of my time, the same company that I used that asked me to teach courses on CD-Rom technology. I said to them, there's this internet thing, you might want to think about doing some courses on that. And they said to me, oh, that's a really good idea. Go away and create one. And so I created half-day courses on the internet for medical librarians, the internet for social science librarians, the internet for so on and so on. And I would spend a lot of time teaching people how that worked. And for a lot of librarians, that really was pretty much their first proper introduction to using the communications aspect of computers. They'd got familiar with computers because they'd used CD-ROM technology. And that's another sort of important aspect there of CD-ROM, because it sort of like hung over into the introduction to CD. Librarians were used to the idea now of using computers and how to turn them on and how a mouse worked and stuff like that. In the early days, I would teach librarians and other people as well how a mouse worked, because they didn't know. And I had to say, if you move this thing here, that moves on the screen. And again, it sounds ridiculous to say it now, but in those early days, nobody understood this. It was a completely new world for them. So I became, because I was running more and more training courses, I went part-time with Silver Platter. And so for an entire year, I was working, because on my days that I wasn't working with Silver Platter, I was out training people. And in 1995, 96, I became an independent internet consultant. And that changed my job completely, because I moved from being employed to really just going out and finding my own work, which was predominantly running a variety of training courses, I would work for training companies, but I would also go to organizations and say, I can teach you about the internet. You need to know about the internet. And they would employ me, and I would go in and I would teach them. I would teach charities. I taught a number of government bodies like the House of Commons Library, the House of Lords Library. I did some training for the European Parliament. I worked for GCHQ in the UK. I worked for charities. I spent a lot of time really trying to go everywhere that I could do to talk about what this internet thing was and how effective it was going to be. And in the early days, we had things like Yahoo. We had things like Ask Jeeves. There was another one called Northern Lights. And we had all of these really early search engines. We had obviously the big one being Alta Vista. And so for me, that was what I found particularly interesting, because with CD, I'd really got into the idea of Boolean operators and all of the good stuff like that, and Venn diagrams and so on. And I really liked the search element. And then, of course, along comes the internet and all of these search engines. And that was where I got really interested in teaching people how to search effectively and what they needed to do. And I spent a lot of time learning about the syntax of different search engines and so on. And when I would run a training course, I would say, which search engine do you use? And the delegates on the courses would come up with 5 or 6 different search engines, and I would write them all down, and we would go through the various merits and advantages and disadvantages of each of them, and carry on that way. By 1999, I wrote my first book. I think it was called The Advanced Internet Searcher's Handbook, my first book really about internet search. Within that edition, Google wasn't mentioned because Google didn't exist. When I produced the second edition of that in 2001, it got a fleeting reference because it still was in its infancy. And it was only by the time I got to the third edition when I was actually able to dedicate an entire chapter to Google. And by then, when I was running my courses and I was saying, which search engines do you use? Just Google, 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 Google. And that was all that people ever used. And I found that quite frustrating because I knew that there were lots of other search engines that were out there that would do different things. And so I spent a lot of time saying, well, there's a search engine that you can use to search for images. There's a search engine you can use to search for videos. There are search engines which are specific to different countries. There are multimedia search engines. There are directory-based search engines. There are free text-based search engines. And that was where I spent a lot of my time just getting information professionals to realize that there was a whole world out there that was a lot more than Google. And one of the things that I always said about Google, which really blew people's minds then, and I think to an extent does now, Google is not a search engine. That's not what Google is at all. Google is an advertising platform that uses search to push adverts at people. That's all that it's ever done. Google has never, ever had an interest in search per se. They added in new functionality to keep people on their search engine as opposed to going to other people's search engines. Yeah, it was great what they did. It was very clever to launch the idea of show people adverts that are related to the subject of the search that they're doing. But Google was a one-trick pony. And yeah, things like Google Maps and Gmail and so on, they're great. But it's still all based around the idea of make a tool that is good enough to get people to come back and use it time and time again. Make sure that it's not good enough so that people will get the answer to their query and go away. Make sure that it's functional enough so that most of the time it works, But there are times when you think, oh, there's an advert, that might give me the answer. And they click on the advert and they go off and do that. Peak Google was about 2011, 2012. That was when it had its greatest amount of functionality. And at that point, yeah, it was a reasonably good search engine. And it was good for information professionals to use because we were able to understand and we could use all of the different syntax and the functionality that was available, which the majority of users just didn't get, because users, they just want answers. They're not interested in searching or how to get good searches. They just want the answer to their question. So that again was an ability and a skill that information professionals were able to learn to teach, to learn for themselves to begin with, to learn how to use different search engines, to broaden out the breadth of the search engines and the functionality that was available, to push that back out into their organizations or into their communities, and further this concept of being a facilitator rather than a gatekeeper. And as I say, peak Google was about 2011, 2012. By then, it had reached such a monopoly. It was able to really discount a lot of what it had been doing. They'd worked quite closely with librarians for a couple of years, and then when they realized that they didn't need the librarians anymore, they just dropped the librarians. Google, in many ways, has been extraordinarily detrimental to the world of information and the world of search. I've never particularly liked Google. I've never been particularly impressed with Google. Google is, and always will be, simply a money-making exercise. And it's not an organization that I like. Yeah, I use the search engine, same as everybody else, up until fairly recently. But that doesn't mean I like it. I certainly don't. I think it was about 2005 or 2006 when I started to say that Google isn't going to be here forever. Google will at some point die. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but I knew that Google was not going to be the answer to information professionals' prayers for, the next, 10, 20, 30 decades. Because I knew that it was functionally flawed, because it wasn't designed to find information, it was designed to push adverts. And once you understand that about Google, everything else that they do makes complete sense. It meant that they could get rid of the really good functionality that they had, because they could say, well, most people don't use it, and we can make it so that we'll do all of the searching for them. And what it meant was that they could just throw adverts at people in much greater number. And if you look at the early pages of Google results, and then you look at the stuff that you get today, the early pages were quite sparse when it came to adverts. If you look at Google today, all that you ever seem to see are adverts one after another. And Google is really at the moment in the fight of its life about AI. But even back then, there were other alternative search engines that worked as well, if not better, than Google. And I spent a lot of my time trying to make librarians aware of that. And in a similar technological train that was running alongside that, there was the whole thing about writing web pages, writing websites. And that was really the first opportunity that librarians had got to produce content for themselves and to make it available on the internet for other people to be able to find. And that meant that people were able to promote their library to a much wider group of people than they'd ever been able to do before. And by creating their own web pages and indeed their own websites, that facilitation function just got extended even further. And so for 2 or 3 years, I happily was teaching people HTML coding and how to put websites together and what they needed to do. And librarians were really good at it, and they had a lot of fun with it. Librarians have always done interesting things with the internet. We go right the way back to the early 90s with things like Gmail, for example. We've always been able to, really utilize the technology that's available to promote the library or the information service that we've got available. So I spent quite a lot of time doing that. But then again, as per normal, the technical people come in and they say, no, that's not your job. Your job is to deal with the books and stuff like that. Let us take it over. Very frustratingly, over and over again, far too many librarians have let that happen. And if I'm critical of the profession, it is that far too many librarians have just said, oh, yes, okay, you're the technical people, you know what you're talking about, we're just the librarians, we'll let you take it over. And time again, the future of librarians and the information professionals and the skills that we've got have almost literally been stolen by tech support people in organizations. And I've always found that really frustrating. You do get holdouts, you do get fantastic, brilliant, amazing librarians who do really excel at using technology and really bringing technology to the rest of the organization. But there are still too many librarians who are, I'm just a librarian. You're not just a librarian. You're not just at anything. You're an incredibly important professional in your organization, in your school, in your community. And I wish that more librarians had more confidence in themselves and their abilities, because that's really the key to being a librarian. It's an incredibly powerful job. But that's kind of got us a bit off track. It's clearly one of my little hobby horses. But yeah, so we had the rise of Google and how it beat just about everything else, apart from the various versions of Microsoft search engines. I was for a small period of time one of the Microsoft search champs, as they dubbed us, and we all gathered in Seattle and spent a few days working with Microsoft, looking at their search engines and saying what worked well and what didn't work well. That was quite an exciting thing to actually be involved with that. I particularly enjoyed doing that. And at this sort of period of time, because I've been writing books, because I've been talking at conferences and exhibitions and things in the UK, I was getting invitations to train in other places or to speak at other conferences around the world. I've visited something like 40 or 50 different countries. I've been around the world a couple of times, spoken at conferences on all of the continents, bar Antarctica. I've taught in the shadow of an active volcano. I've had a Russian soldier point an AK-47 at me. I've taught in some bizarre and strange places, and I've loved all of it. And I never thought for a second that getting a degree in librarianship would be my passport to going around the world and teaching and training. But indeed it has. The idea that people have actually paid me real money to travel to a different country and just talk to them, I still find ridiculous. It still amuses me that people wanted me to do that, but I thoroughly enjoyed doing it. And a lot of that was just teaching people how to search better, how to be more effective with search. But by then, as Google was taking over, we then started to get Web 2. People didn't know what Web 2 was. And so that was the next area that I started to get involved with, talking about Web 2. And then, of course, that morphed into social media, and that was a strange experience because that completely exploded. Everything became out of control, and I spent a lot of my time really trying to get librarians, first of all, to understand that social media was going to be of a benefit to them because they could push out their facilitation role even further. And it meant that they had a much wider way of getting information out and publishing information to people than they'd had before. But at the same time, we were getting organizations that were panicking, as they'd done with the internet. I had organizations that said, we'll have the internet in our organization over my dead body. I think somebody at the British Council said that at one point. And people were constantly trying to block access to information. And they were saying, oh, no, you can't use Facebook, or you can't use social media, you can't use this, you can't use that. And it was really getting librarians to realize the importance of social media and how we could get around that, how you were able to utilize social media tools in able to promote the library and make the library a key component of what an organization was doing within a social media context. So then I started running training courses on how to use social media, how to use a variety of different tools, how to create videos to promote what your library was doing. And so I spent the next 5 or 10 years really in two different tracks. One was still continuing to talk about internet search, and the second was raising the profile of social media and getting librarians to raise the profile of their library using social media. So I did a lot of training in that kind of area, and lots of librarians really loved it. That they absolutely embraced it, and it was an absolute joy to be working in that particular area. And I wrote various different books about using social media in libraries. I had a column I ran for CILIP, the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals in the UK, previously the Library Association. And I spent 10 years writing a column in that, and for various other organisations, publications as well. So it was really sort of like three different areas that I was working in. I was doing a lot of writing, I was doing a lot of teaching, I was doing a lot of talking at conferences and exhibitions really around the world. And that was a role that I basically created for myself, because people would do some of those things, but there was nobody that seemed to be doing all of it. And I just enjoyed it. I just had fun. I really loved all of those different elements, and they all seemed to work quite nicely together for me.
You mentioned how Google encouraged people to go straight to answers without worrying too much about the sort of the niceties of search. But of course, Gen AI goes even further in that direction, in that Gen AI provides you with answers without even any search results. Doesn't it alarm you as an information professional that it sort of seems to eliminate the sort of the whole basis of discovery?
It depends entirely on your definition of what an information professional does. If you are still linked into the idea that an information professional deals with books and deals with information, then yeah, AI is a threat. If your view of an information professional is somewhat different, so that it is a person who facilitates access to information, it's a person who is very political. And I don't think that this is stressed enough. Being an information professional should be a political act. Everything that you do as an information professional should be political in nature, because access to information is anarchic. Organizations, governments, and so on, they want to control that as much as they possibly can do, and we're seeing a lot of that in the UK at the moment with the ironic online safety bill, which is nothing of the sort. They will try to control your access to information. What an information professional can do is it can circumnavigate that, and the role of the information professional now becomes one much more of, again, teaching, facilitating, and getting people to really exercise their critical analytical skills. The role of the professional now is morphing and changing there. We need to be in a position to be able to teach people about misinformation, about disinformation, about propaganda, about the way in which political parties use the information, the way that they manipulate stuff. They need to be in a position to be able to look at organizations that produce AI tools and to work out what the hidden biases are behind those tools, to be able to spread that information out to other people. So I don't think in that respect it's a threat to the information profession at all if you define information professionals as facilitating access to information. There are lots of dangers with AI, don't get me wrong at all, because most of the end users, they're just going to pop a question into ChatGPT or whichever one they prefer. They'll get the answer and they won't think about it. They'll just say, okay, and off they go. Even people like lawyers, I've heard in the States, they've assumed that what ChatGPT has said about particular case law is true, and actually ChatGPT has made it up. And you would think that if anybody was going to have critical analytical skills, it would be a lawyer, but apparently that's not the case. The people that have got critical analytical skills are the information professionals. Information professionals are more important and more attuned with what's going on than lawyers, than doctors. We are the key profession that's out there. And so it's giving us an opportunity to work differently in the future. Yeah, obviously, human beings have to be involved in the production of AI content. And you can't just let AI tools run havoc and go off and do what they want. One of the concerns that I've got is that people will use AI to create content that they'll then put online. AI will then come along and scrape the AI content and reproduce that. And you'll just get AI feeding itself, and errors and inaccuracies are just going to get magnified as a result of that. I think that's a really big danger that I find rather concerning. I'm less concerned about how AI and so on scrape their data. I know that it is something that does concern a lot of people, and the whole copyright issues. I had at least 5 or 6 of my books scraped by OpenAI, which helped train their models. I really don't care. Makes no odds to me whatsoever. It's complete irrelevance as far as I'm concerned. But I do get how people are concerned about that. AI has got lots of other threats, if you want to use that term. It's a very anarchic technology, but then any good technology is going to be an anarchic technology. The whole translation industry, for example, completely dead. It's just gone. The way in which one of the central pillars of using the internet, of using advertising, that's pretty much on its last legs now. That's one of the reasons why Google is really struggling, because Google has always ignored stuff, because Google thinks it knows best. And really, it actually doesn't. Google just continues to talk to itself. The engineers continue to talk to themselves, and they don't reach out further than that. That's why Google is so far behind when it comes to things like Microsoft. Having said that, Google's Gemini, it's a really nice product, and I've spent a lot of time playing with it, and it's getting really good these days. And so I think that they are coming back into the game. But for Google, that central pillar of let's throw adverts out to people, that is now crumbling away really quickly, and they've got to change the way that they work. The whole idea of the serried ranks of links to different web pages, in 18 months' time, we're going to look back and think, oh yeah, I remember that. Wasn't that weird? Why were we so happy with that for like 15 or 20 years? How very strange that was. We don't yet know the effect that AI has got. We are with AI now the way that we were with the internet back in 94 or maybe early 95. We knew that something was going on. We knew that things were going to be different, but we didn't have any concept of how different things were going to become. And we're at that point now. AI is going to be more important than mobile phone technology. It's going to be more important than the internet. It's going to be more important than both of those things combined. And the concern that we've got there is we just don't know what's going to happen. And so we do need to keep a very close watch on AI developments and where AI develops into, because we're in an information age. And who are the best people to deal with AI technology in an information age? Why? It's information professionals. Once again, as I've constantly seen throughout my entire career, the profession that is central to the development and uptake and use of technology has been the information profession, right from when we started back with CD-Rom, all of the way through, including now with AI. And so when COVID hit, I basically retired and thought, that's it, I've done everything, don't need to do anymore. And then I saw this, somebody was talking about this ChatGPT thing, and I thought, oh, I'll take a quick look. Within 5 minutes, I was hooked. I realized how important it was. I realized that I wanted to learn about that. And when I learn about something, I want to teach it to other people. And so for the last 2 or 3 years, AI literally brought me out of retirement to train librarians. And I've trained librarians now literally around the world, not physically any longer, it happens by Zoom. But yeah, I've trained librarians. I've lost count of how many thousands I've trained now, but it's always to get them to understand, to appreciate how AI technology works and how they can utilize that technology for themselves, how they can empower firstly themselves with the information that's available, but then how they are able to empower the user community that they've got, whether it's people in their bank or their university, or whether it's people in their public library community. And it's just another opportunity for information professionals to facilitate, to make things more aware, to make things easier for people to understand, to raise an awareness of the dangers of different kinds of technology. That is, for me, the absolute role of an information professional. It's nothing to do with books. It's something to do with information, but it's mostly about facilitating and helping user communities come to grips with how the world is changing, how they're able to understand it and how they're able to manipulate it and how they're able to make the most of it. And that's why the library in an organization needs to be the absolute central core to everything that organization does. Because if it's not, that organization is going to fail, just flat out will fail, because it's the information professional and the library or the information center, whatever you want to call it, that's the central hub. And if that's there, everything can come into that central hub, and the information professionals can work with it and pull data from here and pass it out over there and see somebody's doing some work here and tell somebody else that work's being done there. And they are central to the way that the organization works. And they can really sort of like oil everything that the organization does. if there isn't a library, an information centre, if there isn't a librarian or an information professional, that organisation is doing lots of different bits in different places. It's disparate and it's going to fail. And that for me is the role of the information professional. So yeah, I'm going to say, yeah, AI, it's great, it's wonderful, it does fantastic things. It's also very dangerous because, as you say, people will just go ask a question, get an answer, and think, okay, great. But it's also a huge opportunity for information professionals to once again grasp that nettle of technology, as they did with CD, as they did with the early internet, as they did with search, as they did with social media. They can now do it again, grasp that nettle of technology, learn how to use it, learn how to make the most of it, and get that information out to their different user communities. So I don't see AI as a threat at all to the profession, depending on how you define what an information professional does. If you see an information professional as somebody that arranges books on shelves, yeah, their time is over. But that's not what an information professional, at least to me, has ever been about.
Well, Phil, it's been great listening to your stories of empowerment of information professionals, and I for one can only tell you how grateful I am to have had that sort of that awareness of not just technical, but if you like, the consequences, the implications of what all these technical developments have meant over the last 25 years. So I'm very grateful for the work, for what you've taught me, and I think everyone who's been in your courses would say the same thing. So I'm very pleased to have talked to you, Phil, and thanks very much for your time.
That's very kind. Thank you very much. And I'm going to leave you. You haven't asked me. I'm going to leave you with one thing. If you're looking at this as an information professional, please, please, please be incredibly proud of what you do. You are the most important people in your organization. Never, ever, ever say you're just a librarian. You should go into your organization and say, I am the librarian. I am the person that can help you do this. I am incredibly important, because you really are. There's no greater role in this entire world than being an information professional. And grab that and hold it and love it and be proud of it. Be proud that you're an information professional. There's nothing better in the world than that.
Very well said. Thanks very much, Phil.
You're welcome.